It began with the cry for bread and ended with the fall of a king, rivers of blood, and the rise of a new empire. This is the true, unfiltered story of the French Revolution, where freedom was born and thousands lost their heads. The French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, was one of the most transformative events in human history. A political, social, and cultural earthquake whose tremors were felt far beyond France's borders. At its core, the revolution was a struggle over the meaning of sovereignty, the limits of power, and the rights of individuals in a world still dominated by hereditary monarchy and rigid social hierarchy. It began as a demand for political reform in a country facing deep financial crisis and spiraling inequality. Yet it evolved into a radical reimagining of society itself, an attempt to replace centuries-old feudal structures with a system built on the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Unlike many political upheavals before it, the French Revolution was not confined to replacing one ruler with another. It aimed to remake the very foundations of the state. It abolished the privileges of the aristocracy, dismantled feudalism, redefined the relationship between the church and the state, and declared the sovereignty of the people. In doing so, it challenged the divine right of kings, a principle that had long underpinned European monarchies, and replaced it with the concept of popular sovereignty. This was not merely a national event, it was a declaration to the world that the political order could be changed through the will of the people. The revolution's scope extended beyond political reform to social transformation. It sought to create a society in which birth no longer determined one's place, in which merit and citizenship replaced noble titles and hereditary privilege. It gave rise to new political ideas that shaped modern democracy, inspired countless liberation movements across the globe, and left a legacy of both triumph and tragedy. In its decade-long journey, the revolution moved through phases of hope, violence, and authoritarian control, ultimately paving the way for Napoleon Bonaparte's rise. But even his empire carried forward many of the revolution's principles. To understand the French Revolution, one must first see the world into which it erupted. Late 18th century Europe was a continent dominated by absolute monarchies. Kings and queens ruled with near total authority, their power justified by the doctrine of divine right, the belief that they governed by God's will and were accountable only to Him. France, under King Louis XVI, was one of the most powerful of these monarchies, but also one of the most financially strained. Decades of costly wars, including the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, and France's support for the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783, had drained the royal treasury. By the 1780s, the French state was heavily indebted, with interest payments consuming a staggering share of its annual revenue. Society in France was structured into the rigid ancien regime, yet paid little in taxes. The second estate was the nobility, who enjoyed hereditary privileges, exemption from most taxes, and significant influence at court. The third estate comprised everyone else, from prosperous bourgeois merchants to impoverished peasants, making up roughly 98% of the population, but bearing the heaviest tax burden. This imbalance fueled deep resentment. Economically, France faced a crisis exacerbated by poor harvests in the 1780s, leading to rising bread prices, bread being the staple food for the majority. For peasants and urban workers, the cost of living rose sharply while wages stagnated, creating widespread hardship. The Enlightenment had also planted seeds of discontent. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu questioned traditional authority and argued for natural rights, political equality, and government accountability. The success of the American Revolution further demonstrated that Enlightenment ideals could be turned into political reality. Across Europe, the political order was conservative and hierarchical. The great powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, maintained large standing armies, carefully guarded their aristocratic privileges, and feared social unrest. Yet beneath the surface, change was brewing. Industrialization was beginning to reshape economies in Britain and parts of Western Europe. Urban centers were growing, and a literate public was increasingly aware of political debates. France stood at the crossroads, a nation of immense cultural influence and intellectual energy, but burdened with outdated institutions that could not adapt to new realities. The French Revolution's significance reaches far beyond its decade of upheaval. It was a turning point in world history that reshaped the political vocabulary of the modern era. Words like citizen, rights, and nation acquired new democratic meanings. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, 1789, proclaimed that all men were born free and equal in rights, inspiring political reformers and revolutionaries from Latin America to Eastern Europe. Even though its promises were imperfectly applied, women, for instance, were excluded from full political rights. Its ideals became a reference point for future struggles for equality. Internationally, the revolution's ideas spread, both through inspiration and through force. Revolutionary France attempted to export its principles by supporting uprisings abroad, and later through the armies of Napoleon. A Napoleonic Code, introduced in the early 19th century, modernized legal systems across much of Europe and parts of Latin America, embedding the concepts of equality before the law and the secular state. In this sense, the revolution not only transformed France's political system, but also rewrote the rules of governance for much of the world. Its legacy is also visible in the enduring tension between ideals and realities in political change. The revolution promised liberty, yet it produced periods of repression. It sought equality, yet social divisions persisted. It championed fraternity, yet it descended into civil war and mass executions. These contradictions have made it both a source of inspiration and a cautionary tale for later generations. In the centuries since 1789, revolutions, democratic movements, and even anti-colonial struggles have drawn upon the language, the image of the storming of the Bastille. The red liberty cap and the tricolor flag became emblems of resistance and popular sovereignty. Today, in debates over human rights, secularism, and the role of the state, echoes of the revolution's ideals still resonate. Why does it still matter? Because it posed, and in many ways left unanswered, the fundamental questions of modern politics. How should power be distributed? What is the role of the people in governance? Can equality be achieved without sacrificing liberty? These questions remain central to political discourse in the 21st century, making the French Revolution not just a historical episode, but a continuing conversation. Causes of the French Revolution. The French Revolution did not erupt out of nowhere in 1789. It was the product of decades, even centuries, of accumulated tensions, systemic injustices, and failed attempts at reform. Political rigidity, entrenched social privilege, economic hardship, and revolutionary ideas created a perfect storm. By the late 1780s, France was a powder keg, and the spark was inevitable. Political causes, absolute monarchy, and the Bourbon kings. For centuries, France had been ruled by an absolute monarchy, with the Bourbon dynasty at its head. The kings of France claimed to rule by divine right, a doctrine that held their authority came directly from God and was not subject to the will of the people. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had perfected this model in the 17th century, centralizing power in the royal court at Versailles and weakening the influence of the nobility by tying them to ceremonial life. By the 18th century, however, this system, the Ancien Régime, had begun to crack. Louis XV, reign 1715 to 1774, inherited a realm with vast influence, but a rigid political structure that was resistant to adaptation. Decision-making remained concentrated in the hands of the monarch and his ministers, with no meaningful participation from the wider population. The Estates General, France's representative, leaving the country without a functioning parliamentary check on royal authority. Louis XV's reign became associated with corruption, court intrigues, and costly wars. He pursued foreign adventures, most disastrously, the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, that drained the treasury and weakened France's global position. His private life, including notorious relationships with mistresses like Madame de Pompadour, fed a public perception of moral decay and detachment detachment from the suffering of the people. The crown's prestige diminished, but the monarchy's absolute nature remained unchanged. The failure of reforms under Louis XV and Louis XVI. Louis XVI, reign of 1774 to 1792, came to power with good intentions, but little political skill. He inherited a kingdom deeply in debt and facing growing discontent, and he appointed reform-minded ministers such as Turgot, Necker, and Cologne. These ministers proposed changes to modernize France's finances, including introducing fairer taxation and reducing the privileges of the nobility. But each attempt at reform ran into the same obstacle: the entrenched resistance of privileged estates, especially the nobility, who dominated the parliament, regional high courts, and used their influence to block measures that threatened their interests. Louis XVI's vacillation made matters worse. He would back reforms in principle, but retreat under aristocratic pressure. In 1787 to 88, when the Assembly of Notables refused to approve new taxes, the king was forced into the unprecedented step of calling the Estates General for 1789. What was intended as a way to solve a fiscal crisis would instead become the platform for a political revolution. Enlightenment ideas and the challenge to absolutism. By the late 18th century, the Enlightenment had profoundly altered Europe's intellectual climate. Philosophers and writers, often working under censorship, questioned the legitimacy of absolute monarchy and hereditary privilege. Voltaire attacked the abuses of church and state, championing civil liberties, freedom of speech, and religious tolerance. Montesquieu, in The Spirit of the Laws, 1748, argued for the separation of powers as a safeguard against tyranny. Rousseau, in The Social Contract, 1752, declared that sovereignty belonged to the people, not a monarch, and that legitimate government must be based on the general will. These ideas circulated widely among France's literate elite through salons, coffee houses, and clandestine pamphlets. Even those who had never read the works of Rousseau or Montesquieu could absorb their messages indirectly through political gossip, satire, and public debate. The very language of politics began to change. Instead of subjects of the king, people increasingly saw themselves as citizens with rights. Social causes. The Three Estates system. French society in the late 18th century was divided into three legally defined estates, a structure that dated back to the Middle Ages. The First Estate, the clergy, numbering about 130,000, who owned roughly 10% of the land. The Catholic Church collected tithes from the population and was exempt from most taxes, though it sometimes made voluntary contributions to the state. The Second Estate, the nobility, about 350,000 people, less than 2% of the population, owned around 25 to 30% of the land. They enjoyed privileges such as exemption from many taxes, exclusive rights to hunt and bear arms, and preference for high offices in the military and government. The Third Estate. Everyone else, about 98% of the population, including prosperous bourgeois merchants, urban workers, sans-culottes, and rural peasants. This system was inherently unjust. While the First and Second Estates lived with privileges, the Third Estate, which produced the wealth of the nation through labor, trade, and agriculture, shouldered the cost of the state. Privileges of the clergy and nobility. Both the clergy and the nobility were deeply resented for their privileges. The church not only collected tithes, but also censored books and maintained control over education and moral life. Many bishops and abbots lived in luxury, far from their parishes, while parish priests often lived modestly, creating a divide even within the clergy. The nobility guarded their privileges fiercely. Many nobles had retreated from their feudal responsibilities, but continued to extract feudal dues from peasants. They monopolized key positions in the army, the church hierarchy, and the royal bureaucracy. As Enlightenment ideas spread, the gap between noble privilege and the ideals of equality became glaring. Burden on the Third Estate. The Third Estate paid the tile, land tax, gabelle, salt tax, and numerous feudal dues. Urban workers faced rising food prices, while peasants were often one bad harvest away from starvation. The bourgeoisie, despite their wealth, were barred from many offices reserved for nobles, creating a frustration that would find expression in 1789. Economic causes, financial crisis and national debt. France's financial troubles were severe. The 7 Years' War and the American War of Independence cost enormous sums. By the 1780s, the national debt had ballooned to over 4 billion livres, and interest payments consumed more than half the annual budget. Attempts to reform taxation, to make nobles and clergy contribute their fair share, were blocked by the privileged estates. Poor harvests, food shortages, and rising bread prices. Agriculture dominated France's economy, and bad weather in the late 1780s led to disastrous harvests. The 1788 harvest was especially poor, causing bread prices to skyrocket in 1789. Bread made up the majority of a worker's diet, so when prices doubled, hunger and unrest followed. Urban markets became flashpoints for riots, and rural areas saw thefts from grain stores. The role of wars, especially the American Revolution. France's intervention in the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, was both a political statement against Britain and a financial disaster. While it gave France a sense of having championed liberty abroad, it also deepened the fiscal crisis. Ironically, soldiers who served in America returned with revolutionary ideals, having seen a functioning republic in action. Intellectual causes Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu. The philosophy of rights and governance. The Enlightenment provided the intellectual ammunition for revolution. Rousseau advocated popular sovereignty, the idea that government exists to serve the general will of the people. Voltaire denounced arbitrary power and religious intolerance, calling for rational governance. Montesquieu promoted the separation of powers and constitutional limits on government. These thinkers did not create the revolution single-handedly, but they shaped the political imagination of its leaders and participants. Their writings turned grievances into a coherent political vision. Conclusion: the convergence of causes. The French Revolution was not caused by a single event, but by the convergence of political rigidity, social injustice, economic hardship, and revolutionary ideas. The Bourbon monarchy had lost touch with the needs of its people. The privileged estates resisted reform. The economy faltered, and Enlightenment ideals made these injustices intolerable. By 1789, France was a society in which the old order could no longer function, and the people were ready and increasingly determined to build a new one. 1789, the spark of revolution. The year 1789 stands as a turning point in French history. The moment when centuries of political, social, and economic tension erupted into a dramatic and transformative upheaval. After decades of fiscal crisis, social inequality, and rising popular discontent, the mechanisms of monarchy and aristocratic privilege began to crack. What had been simmering quietly across towns, cities, and villages suddenly ignited into open revolt. The events of 1789, from the convocation of the Estates General to the Women's March on Versailles, set in motion a chain reaction that would forever alter France and influence the world. The Estates General and the deadlock. By 1789, the French monarchy faced a dire financial crisis. Louis XVI, under pressure from a collapsing treasury, convened the Estates General in May of that year, an assembly that had not met since 1614. Its purpose was ostensibly to seek consent for new taxation and to advise the king, but it also became a forum for the expression of grievances long suppressed. The Estates General was divided into three estates: the clergy, First Estate; the nobility, Second Estate; and the commoners, Third Estate. Although the Third Estate represented roughly 98% of the population, voting was conducted by estate, meaning that the First and Second Estates could outvote them 2-1. This arrangement immediately led to deadlock. The Third Estate demanded double representation to reflect its numerical majority, but the king hesitated, creating political tension. The deadlock revealed the fundamental problem of the Ancien regime, a rigid system incapable of addressing the demands of a society undergoing social, economic, and intellectual transformation. The Third Estate, composed of lawyers, professionals, and bourgeois merchants increasingly recognized that compromise within the existing structure was impossible. What began as a petition for reform would soon transform into a revolutionary assertion of authority. The Tennis Court Oath, birth of the National Assembly. On June 17, 1789, frustrated by the king's refusal to grant meaningful reforms, the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, claiming the right to represent the French people. When they found their meeting hall locked and guarded on June 20th, possibly by royal order, they relocated to a nearby indoor tennis court. There, they swore the famous Tennis Court Oath, vowing not to disband until they had drafted a constitution for France. This act was more than a symbolic gesture. It represented the first organized challenge to absolute monarchy in centuries. By asserting their authority as representatives of the nation, the deputies of the Third Estate effectively claimed sovereignty for the people rather than the king. The oath was a revolutionary act in principle, signaling that political legitimacy depended on popular consent, not divine right. The storming of the Bastille. Tensions in Paris reached a boiling point by mid-July. Rumors of royal troops surrounding the capital and attacks on reformist deputies inflamed public anxiety. On July 14, 1789, a crowd of Parisians stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress and prison that symbolized the arbitrary power of the monarchy. Although only 7 prisoners were held inside at the time, and the fortress was poorly defended, its capture carried immense symbolic weight. The Bastille represented the monarchy's tyranny, the unchecked authority of Louis XVI, and the system that had allowed the privileged classes to dominate the common people for centuries. Its fall sent shockwaves across France, inspiring uprisings in towns and villages, and demonstrating that ordinary citizens could directly challenge the king's authority. The storming of the Bastille became the defining moment of 1789. A powerful symbol of revolutionary courage and popular sovereignty that remains iconic to this day. The Great Fear and peasant uprisings. In the months following the fall of the Bastille, fear and unrest spread throughout rural France. The Great Fear, La Grande Peur, swept the countryside during July and August 1789. Rumors of aristocratic conspiracies that nobles were hiring mercenaries to suppress the peasantry caused widespread panic. Villagers armed themselves, attacked manor houses, and destroyed feudal records, documenting taxes and dues. These uprisings were driven not only by fear, but also by long-standing resentment toward feudal obligations. Peasants, who had for generations paid feudal dues to landlords and church officials, seized the moment to assert their rights. The Great Fear demonstrated that the revolution was no longer limited to Parisian intellectuals or urban mobs. It had become a national movement involving millions of rural inhabitants, fundamentally challenging the economic and social foundations of the Ancien Regime. Abolition of feudalism. responding to the rural revolts and the rising pressure from the National Assembly. The Assembly undertook one of its most radical actions, the abolition of feudal privileges. On August 4th, 1789, it decreed the end of feudalism, eliminating many dues, tithes, and labor obligations that bound peasants to their landlords. This decision was revolutionary in both practical and symbolic terms. Practically, it freed millions of peasants from centuries of economic oppression. Symbolically, it signaled the dismantling of the social hierarchy that had defined France for centuries. Nobles surrendered their privileges voluntarily in some cases, recognizing that resistance was futile. In others, peasants enforced the change themselves, burning feudal documents and asserting a new social order. The abolition of feudalism was a decisive step toward equality and marked the beginning declaration of the rights of man and of the citizen. Building on these early reforms, the National Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen on August 26, 1789. Inspired by Enlightenment principles and the American Declaration of Independence, it proclaimed fundamental rights: liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. It emphasized equality before the law and the notion that sovereignty resided in the people, not the monarch. The Declaration also established the principle of legal equality, freedom of speech and religion, and the right to participate in government. Although it did not extend full political rights to women, an omission that would later provoke critique and activism, it laid the philosophical groundwork for modern democracy. It represented the revolution's ideological heart. Transforming Women's March on Versailles, the revolution's momentum reached a climax in October 1789, when thousands of women, incensed by food shortages and the high price of bread, marched from Paris to the royal palace at Versailles. Known as the Women's March on Versailles, the event was both a protest and a demand for political accountability. Armed with weapons and accompanied by men, the marchers forced the king to leave Versailles and return to Paris, effectively placing him under the watchful eye of the revolutionaries. The march demonstrated the active participation of women in the revolution and underscored the link between social grievances, hunger, economic inequality, and political action. It also symbolized a profound shift. The monarchy, once distant and untouchable, was now subject to the will of the people. Conclusion: 1789 as the year of revolution. At the end of 1789, France had been transformed. The Estates General had evolved into the National Assembly, asserting the sovereignty of the people. Feudalism had been abolished, the principles of liberty and equality enshrined in law, and the monarchy constrained and relocated under popular oversight. Ordinary citizens, men and women, urban and rural, had demonstrated that collective action could reshape the social and political order. The events of 1789 were the spark of a revolution that would continue to evolve, radicalize, and ultimately reshape the course of French history. They revealed the convergence of political, social, economic, and intellectual forces, and offered a vivid demonstration of how ideas, grievances, and action could combine to challenge entrenched authority. Above all, 1789 showed that the French people were no longer willing to accept a world defined by privilege, oppression, and inequality. A lesson that would echo across Europe and the globe for generations to come. 1790, 1791, Reform and Resistance. The years 1790 and 1791 marked a critical transition in the French Revolution. The initial explosion of 1789 had toppled feudal structures and imposed the principles of liberty and equality upon France. But these reforms were only the beginning. The National Assembly now faced the immense challenge of building a functioning state on revolutionary principles, all while navigating the resistance of entrenched institutions and the ambivalence of the monarchy. These 2 years were characterized by ambitious legislation, growing political activism, and the first clear signs that the revolution would become not just a national upheaval, but a radical reordering of society with deep ideological divides. Civil Constitution of the Clergy. One of the revolution's most controversial reforms came in 1790 with the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. The French Revolution, grounded in Enlightenment ideals, sought to subordinate the Catholic Church, long a pillar of monarchical power, to the authority of the state. The Church in France had accumulated vast wealth and wielded immense influence over education, law, and public morality. It also collected tithes, maintained privileged status, and resisted political reform. The Civil Constitution attempted to restructure the Church in several revolutionary ways. Reorganization of dioceses. Church boundaries were redrawn to align with the newly established administrative departments, consolidating authority under the state. Election of clergy. Bishops and priests would now be elected by the people rather than appointed by the monarchy or the Pope. State salaries. Clergy were to be paid by the state. Oath of loyalty. All clergy were required to swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution, effectively making them accountable to the revolutionary government rather than the Pope. The reform split the clergy into 2 groups: constitutional priests, who accepted the new law, and refractory priests, who remained loyal to Rome. This division had profound consequences. In rural areas, where religious devotion was strongest, peasants often resisted revolutionary priests, fueling unrest and laying the groundwork for counter-revolutionary movements in provinces such as the Vendée. For the monarchy, the Constitution of the Clergy was a test of authority, as Louis XVI vacillated between signing it and resisting it, signaling his reluctance to fully embrace revolutionary change. Reorganization of the French state. The revolution also sought to modernize and centralize the French state. Inspired by Enlightenment principles, the National Assembly reorganized France into 83 departments, each with elected councils and standardized legal and administrative structures. This replaced the patchwork of provinces, parliaments, and feudal jurisdictions that had previously made governance inconsistent and arbitrary. Alongside administrative reforms, the Assembly pursued legal codification. Feudal dues were abolished, privileges were eliminated, and laws were standardized to reflect the principles of equality and individual rights. These reforms aimed to create a rational, meritocratic state in which citizenship, rather than birth, determined participation and opportunity. Economically, the Assembly attempted to stabilize the state's finances through reforms such as the issue of assignats, a form of government-backed currency. While initially intended to alleviate the fiscal crisis, assignats would later contribute to inflation and economic instability, illustrating the complex interplay between revolutionary ideals and practical governance. Louis XVI's attempted escape, flight to Varennes. By 1791, it became increasingly clear that the monarchy's loyalty to the revolution was fragile. Louis XVI, though publicly cooperative, privately sought ways to restore absolute authority. In June 1791, he attempted to flee Paris with his family in what became known as the Flight to Varennes. The royal family's flight was poorly planned and quickly thwarted. They were recognized and arrested in the town of Varennes, then returned to Paris under guard. This event shattered any remaining illusions of royal support for constitutional monarchy. Public trust in the king collapsed, and revolutionary leaders began to question whether the monarchy could coexist with the principles of 1789. The flight to Varennes marked a turning point, signaling that the revolution would increasingly confront not just aristocratic privilege, but the monarchy itself. Growing political clubs, Jacobins, Cordeliers, Feuillants. The political landscape of France in 1790 to 1791 was characterized by the rise of political clubs, which became centers for debate, mobilization, and ideological formation. Jacobins, originally moderate reformers, the Jacobins became increasingly radical, advocating for broader political participation, secular governance, and the defense of revolutionary principles against internal and external threats. Cordeliers, known for their populist orientation, the Cordeliers championed direct action, social equality, and vigilance against counter-revolutionary plots. Leaders such as Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins would become central figures in later revolutionary events. Feuillants, by contrast. The Feuillants represented constitutional monarchists who supported a limited monarchy under the Constitution. They opposed radical measures and sought to stabilize the revolution without dismantling the monarchy entirely. These clubs fostered intense political debate, mobilized public opinion, and reflected the fragmentation of revolutionary France into factions with differing visions of liberty, equality, and governance. They also demonstrated that the revolution was not just a top-down reform process, but a mass political movement shaped by active citizens. Constitution of 1791 and creation of the Legislative Assembly. The culmination of the National Assembly's efforts was the Constitution of 1791, formally establishing a constitutional monarchy. Key features included separation of powers. The king retained executive authority, but legislative power resided in the newly created Legislative Assembly. Suffrage and representation. Voting rights were limited to active citizens, primarily property-owning men, reflecting a compromise between revolutionary ideals and the desire of the bourgeoisie to maintain influence. Civil liberties. The Constitution incorporated the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, ensuring legal equality, freedom of expression, and the right to participate in government. While the Constitution represented a milestone in codifying revolutionary principles, it also exposed tensions between the monarchy, the Legislative Assembly, and the people. Conclusion: reform and resistance. The period of 1790 to 1791 was defined by ambitious reforms and growing resistance. The civil constitution of the clergy, administrative reorganization, and the creation of the Legislative Assembly illustrated the National Assembly's commitment to building a rational, meritocratic, and secular state. Yet, the monarchy's hesitance, economic instability, and rising factionalism revealed that revolutionary change was far from secure. Louis XVI's flight to Varennes underscored the fragility of constitutional monarchy, while the emergence of political clubs indicated that the revolution was increasingly shaped by mass participation, radical ideas, and ideological conflict. These developments created a volatile environment in which compromise was difficult and confrontation inevitable. The events of 1790 to 1791 laid the groundwork for the more radical phases of the revolution. They demonstrated that reform alone could not satisfy the demands of a populace empowered by Enlightenment ideals, and that resistance, both from the monarchy and conservative forces, would provoke further revolutionary escalation. France was no longer a society seeking incremental reform. It was a nation on the edge of profound transformation, with competing visions of liberty, equality, and political legitimacy, driving it toward an uncertain future. 1792, the revolution radicalizes. By 1792, the French Revolution had moved well beyond its original aim of constitutional monarchy. What began in 1789 as a push for reform had, over the course of 3 turbulent years, destabilized France's centuries-old political order. The monarchy was weakened, but still present. The people were restless. Foreign monarchies looked on with suspicion and fear. It was a year that would see the revolution transform into something far more radical. A period of war, bloodshed, and the outright destruction of monarchy. War with Austria and Prussia. The French Revolution, with its attack on aristocratic privilege and divine right monarchy, was deeply unsettling to the crowned heads of Europe. Kings and emperors feared that revolutionary ideals might spread to their own realms. The French émigrés, nobles who had fled to Austria, Prussia, and beyond, actively lobbied for foreign intervention to restore the Bourbon monarchy. In April 1792, under pressure from the Girondins, a political faction advocating for the spread of revolutionary ideals through war, France declared war on Austria. The decision was also encouraged by Louis XVI himself, though for opposite reasons. He hoped France's defeat would restore his authority. The war quickly went badly for France. The French army was poorly trained, badly equipped, and plagued by internal distrust. Many officers were aristocrats whose loyalty was questionable, while revolutionary soldiers distrusted their commanders. Desertions were rampant. Early defeats in the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, fed suspicions of treachery. The situation escalated when Austria and Prussia formalized their alliance against revolutionary France. On July 25, 1792, the Prussian commander, the Duke of Brunswick, issued the infamous Brunswick Manifesto, threatening to destroy Paris if any harm came to the royal family. Rather than intimidate the revolutionaries, the manifesto enraged them. It was perceived as proof that the king was conspiring with foreign enemies. Rise of the sans-culottes. As military defeats mounted, political tensions in Paris intensified. The working-class revolutionaries, known as sans-culottes, without knee breeches, referring to their plain trousers as opposed to aristocratic silk breeches, emerged as a powerful force. They were artisans, shopkeepers, laborers, and small traders, radical in their demands for equality, price controls, and harsh measures against counter-revolutionaries. The sans-culottes distrusted the monarchy, feared treason within the government, and demanded more direct, popular control over politics. They were not a formal political party, but a movement, militant, organized, and often violent when they believed the revolution was in danger. By the summer of 1792, they had grown frustrated with the moderate Legislative Assembly's failure to address food shortages, military defeats, and perceived royal treachery. Allied with radical political clubs, such as the Jacobins and Cordeliers, they began organizing for decisive action. The storming of the Tuileries. On August 10, 1792, the tension broke. The sans-culottes, joined by National Guard units from the provinces and supported by revolutionary sections of Paris, marched on the Tuileries Palace, where Louis XVI and his family resided under constitutional house arrest. The palace was defended by Swiss guards and royalist supporters. Fighting was fierce and bloody. By the end of the day, the palace had been overrun. The Swiss guards massacred, and the royal family had fled to the safety of the Legislative Assembly, only to be formally suspended from power. This insurrection marked the effective end of the French monarchy's authority. Though the Republic had not yet been declared, it also radicalized the revolution. The moderate constitutional monarchy was dead, and a new phase of popular democracy, heavily influenced by the streets of Paris, had begun. September massacres. The fall of the monarchy did not stabilize France. It deepened the crisis. In September, the Prussian army invaded France and defeated French forces at the Battle of Verdun, opening the road to Paris. Panic swept the city. Rumors circulated that imprisoned royalists and counter-revolutionaries were plotting to escape and aid the enemy. In an explosion of paranoia and rage, mobs broke into prisons across Paris between September 2nd and September 6th, murdering over 1,000 prisoners, including political detainees, priests who had refused to take the civil constitution oath, and common criminals. These September massacres shocked Europe. For royalists and moderates, they were evidence that the revolution had descended into mob rule and bloodlust. For radicals like Marat, they were a necessary purge of traitors in a time of national emergency. Abolition of the monarchy and birth of the French Republic. On September 20th, 1792, French forces achieved a surprise victory over the Prussians at the Battle of Valmy. Though militarily minor, the psychological impact was enormous. It boosted revolutionary morale and helped solidify the radicals' hold on power. The very next day, the newly elected National Convention met for the first time. Composed largely of radical Jacobins and Girondins, it acted swiftly. On September 21st, 1792, the convention abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. This was not just a political change, it was a cultural revolution. Symbols of monarchy were destroyed, royal titles were abolished, and the Gregorian calendar was replaced with a new revolutionary calendar designed to erase religious and royalist associations. France had entered a new, uncharted political era, one where the king himself would soon face trial for treason, and the revolution would begin to devour both its enemies. Conclusion: 1792 as the turning point. The year 1792 marked the moment when the French Revolution became truly revolutionary, abandoning compromise with monarchy, embracing popular radicalism, and confronting a continent at war. The events of this year, the war, the fall of the Tuileries, the September massacres, and the abolition of the monarchy, transformed the revolution from a national political reform movement into an international ideological struggle. It also set France on the path to the Reign of Terror, where revolutionary zeal, fear of betrayal, and the pressures of war would justify unprecedented violence in the name of liberty. 1793 to 1794, the Reign of Terror. The French Revolution, in its early years, had promised liberty, equality, and fraternity. By 1793, however, the revolution was fighting for its very survival against invading armies, rebellious provinces, royalist plots, and the deep fractures within its own ranks. In this crucible of war and paranoia, the ideals of 1789 were transformed into a machinery of surveillance, accusation, and execution. The period from 1793 to 1794, known as the Reign of Terror, remains one of the most controversial episodes in European history, a time when revolutionary justice became indistinguishable from political vengeance, and the guillotine became the symbol of a republic defending itself. Execution of Louis XVI, the point of no return. The revolution crossed an irreversible threshold on January 21, 1793, when Louis XVI was led to the guillotine in the Place de la Révolution. His trial, conducted by the National Convention, was not simply a legal proceeding. It was an ideological battle over whether the revolution could coexist with monarchy at all. Found guilty of conspiring with foreign powers and of betraying the nation, Louis was condemned to death by a narrow margin. His execution sent shockwaves across Europe. To royalist powers like Austria, Prussia, and Britain, regicide was an unforgivable provocation. Diplomatically, France was now isolated. Domestically, the act intensified factional divisions. Moderates who had tolerated the revolution while hoping for a constitutional monarchy recoiled from the bloodshed. For radical Jacobins, however, Louis's death was necessary. France at war on all fronts, Louis's death triggered a widening of the War of the First Coalition. Britain, the Dutch Republic, and Spain joined Austria and Prussia in declaring war on France. At the same time, the new republic faced civil war at home. In the Vendée region, royalist peasants, enraged by anti-clerical policies, conscription, and attacks on their traditional way of life, rose in armed rebellion. The Vendéan uprising became a brutal, counter-revolutionary war with atrocities committed on both sides. Meanwhile, in cities like Lyon, Marseille, and Bordeaux, Federalist revolts broke out against the dominance of Paris and the radical Jacobin leadership. France was literally encircled by enemy armies outside and by rebellion within. The National Convention responded by declaring La Patrie en danger, the fatherland in danger. This call to arms led to mass conscription, levée en masse, in August 1793, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of soldiers. The Committee of Public Safety, Robespierre, Danton, Marat, to coordinate this effort and suppress internal dissent. The convention created the Committee of Public Safety in April 1793. Initially dominated by figures like Georges Danton and Maximilien Robespierre, the committee quickly became the de facto executive of revolutionary France. The committee centralized authority, overseeing the army, foreign policy, and internal security. It claimed to act in the name of the people, but in practice, it concentrated power in the hands of a few men. The Jacobin belief was that republican virtue could only be preserved through vigilance and, when necessary, terror. One of the most radical voices was Jean-Paul Marat, editor of L'Ami du Peuple. Marat called for uncompromising action against enemies within: nobles, priests, moderates, and anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary leanings. His assassination in July 1793 by Charlotte Corday, a Girondin sympathizer, turned him into a martyr for the radical cause. The convention honored him with a hero's funeral, and his image became part of revolutionary iconography, revolutionary tribunals, and mass executions. The Jacobin-led government passed a series of laws that expanded the power of the Revolutionary Tribunal. The Law of Suspects, September 1793, made it possible to arrest and try anyone accused of being an enemy of liberty. A definition so broad, it included former nobles, refractory priests, journalists, merchants accused of hoarding goods, and even former revolutionaries who questioned the government's direction. In Paris, the guillotine worked relentlessly. The most famous victim in this wave was Queen Marie Antoinette, executed in October 1793 after a highly politicized trial. Many Girondin leaders, once influential members of the convention, were also executed. Provincial cities saw their own terrors. In Lyon, after a federalist revolt, Jacobin forces conducted mass shootings and guillotinings to break resistance. In Nantes, Republican forces drowned hundreds of. This was terror as policy, the belief that swift, visible punishment would deter enemies and unify the nation under the revolutionary banner. Role of propaganda and revolutionary culture. The Reign of Terror was not only about repression, it was also about creating a new civic identity. Revolutionary festivals replaced religious holidays, celebrating reason, unity, and the Republic. Churches were repurposed as temples of reason. The Jacobins introduced a new republican calendar, abolishing the old Gregorian system and erasing saint days. Propaganda flooded public life. Posters, pamphlets, plays, and speeches glorified the sans-culottes, vilified aristocrats, and depicted France as a beacon of liberty under siege from tyrants. Robespierre, in particular, emphasized the idea of virtue, the moral purity necessary to sustain the Republic. But virtue, in his view, could not exist without terror to protect it. The fall of Danton and Desmoulins. By early 1794, divisions emerged within the revolutionary leadership itself. Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins, both once staunch Jacobins, began to argue for moderation. They criticized the endless executions, warning that the revolution risked devouring its own children. Desmoulins, through his newspaper Le Vieux Cordelier, called for clemency. Robespierre and his allies saw this as dangerous weakness. In April 1794, Danton, Desmoulins, and their followers were arrested, tried, and executed. Their deaths showed that no one was safe from the guillotine. Even those who had helped build the very system now turning against them. The fall of Robespierre, Thermidorian reaction. The terror reached its peak in mid-1794. Robespierre, now the dominant figure on the Committee of Public Safety, introduced the cult of the Supreme Being, attempting to provide the revolution with a civic religion centered on morality and deism. But his growing power, moralizing tone, and refusal to explain who his next political targets might be alarmed even his allies. On 9th Thermidor Year 2, July 27th, 1794, members of the convention turned on Robespierre. He and his closest supporters were arrested and, after a brief struggle, sent to the guillotine without trial. The crowd that once cheered his speeches now watched silently. This Thermidorian reaction ended the Reign of Terror. The revolutionary tribunal's powers were curtailed, political prisoners were released, and a more moderate phase of the revolution began. But the legacy of 1793 to 1794, the belief that ideals could be defended through terror. Conclusion: terror and the revolution's paradox. The Reign of Terror was born from the revolution's noblest ambitions and darkest fears. Faced with war, rebellion, and political conspiracy, the Jacobins argued that extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. Yet in trying to defend liberty, they curtailed it. In trying to protect the Republic, they turned it into an authoritarian regime. For some historians, the terror was a tragic necessity, a desperate defense against overwhelming odds. For others, it was a betrayal of the very ideals that inspired 1789. Either way, it remains a stark reminder of the revolution's paradox, that the pursuit of virtue, when fused with absolute power, can lead to the guillotine. 19399. The Directory Era. The fall of Robespierre in July 1794 had left France exhausted, traumatized, and politically unstable. The blood-soaked guillotine of the Reign of Terror was no longer the symbol of revolutionary virtue, but a reminder of the dangers of unrestrained political fanaticism. Out of this turbulence emerged a new government, the Directory, a regime that promised stability, moderation, and a return to legality, but ultimately became a story of corruption, political repression, and military dependency, ending with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. Birth of the Directory. A new constitution. After Robespierre's execution, the Thermidorian reaction dismantled the machinery of terror. The Jacobin Club was shut down. Revolutionary tribunals were curbed, and political prisoners were freed. But France was still at war. its economy was unstable, and political violence continued to simmer. In 1795, the National Convention drafted the Constitution of Year 3, using the new revolutionary calendar. It was explicitly designed to prevent the concentration of power in one body, a direct reaction to the excesses of the Committee of Public Safety. The new system featured a bicameral legislature, the Council of 500, which proposed laws, the Council of Ancients, 250 members, which approved or rejected them, an executive of 5 directors, chosen by the Ancients from a list provided by the 500, serving staggered terms to avoid sudden power shifts. The idea was to create checks and balances, but in practice, the system was cumbersome, unstable, and unable to respond quickly to crises. The White Terror and political backlash. In the immediate aftermath of the terror, Royalists and moderates sought revenge on former Jacobins. This period, known as the White Terror, saw gangs of young Royalist sympathizers, the Jeunesse Dorée, or Gilded Youth, attacking sans-culottes in the streets. Former radicals were harassed, beaten, and even killed. The Thermidorians also reversed economic controls that had kept food affordable during the terror. The abolition of the law of the maximum, which had fixed prices, led to rampant inflation. Bread prices soared, and urban workers faced hunger once again. Uprisings and the Directory's first crisis, economic hardship combined with Royalist plotting and Jacobin resentment to create an explosive situation. Rising of 12 Germinal Year 3, April 1795. Sans-culottes demanded bread and the reinstatement of the 1793 Constitution. The revolt was quickly suppressed without major bloodshed. Rising of 1 Prairial Year 3, May 1795. This was more serious. Armed crowds stormed the convention demanding bread and the Constitution of 1793. The army was brought in, and the insurrection was crushed. Dozens were executed, marking the last major popular uprising of the Revolution. Later, in 1795, France faced the Royalist insurrection of 13 Vendémiaire. October 5th, 1795, Royalists in Paris attempted to seize power, but the army, under the young artillery officer Napoleon Bonaparte. France under the Directory. Corruption and instability. From late 1795 onward, the Directory governed a France weary of extremism, but still deeply divided. The regime's main characteristics: economic troubles, inflation persisted, and the assignat paper currency collapsed in value. Peasants were reluctant to part with grain, leading to shortages. Corruption and speculation. The government and its officials became infamous for personal enrichment. Contracts for military supplies were awarded to friends, and bribery flourished. Political repression. Both Royalists and Jacobins were targeted. Press censorship returned. Clubs were restricted, and opponents were deported without trial. The Directory's legitimacy suffered because it relied heavily on military force to maintain order, a dangerous precedent. Political polarization and the Fructidor coup. By 1797, royalists were gaining influence, especially in the legislature. Alarmed that the monarchy might be restored, 3 directors, with the help of army generals, staged the coup of 18 Fructidor, September 4th, 1797. Royalist leaders were arrested, elections were annulled, and press freedoms were further restricted. The Directory had openly abandoned constitutional legality to survive, a move that weakened its credibility. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign and the Directory's decline. In 1798, the Directory approved Napoleon's ambitious plan to strike at British interests by invading Egypt. Initially successful, capturing. Meanwhile, in Europe, a new second coalition, Britain, Austria, Russia, and others, began winning back territory from France. Military defeats undermined the Directory's prestige, and the economic situation worsened again. The coup of 18 Brumaire, end of the revolution. By late 1799, France was politically deadlocked, militarily strained, and desperate for decisive leadership. Many in the political elite saw Napoleon as the solution. Returning secretly from Egypt, he allied with key politicians, including Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès. On the 18th Brumaire, Year 8, November 9th, 1799, Napoleon staged a coup d'état. Under the pretext of protecting the Republic from an alleged Jacobin plot, he and his allies used soldiers to intimidate the legislature, dissolve the Directory, and establish the consulate, with Napoleon as first consul. This marked the official end of the French Revolution. While many of its social and legal reforms endured, political power had shifted decisively toward authoritarian rule. Conclusion. Legacy of the Directory. The Directory era was a paradox. It ended the chaos of the Terror, but failed to establish a durable democracy. It relied on repression and the military, alienated both radicals and conservatives, and ultimately paved the way for Napoleon's rise. Its 5 years showed the revolution's unresolved tension between liberty and order, a tension that would continue to shape France under the Empire. Themes and legacy of the French Revolution, 1789 to 1799. The French Revolution was not just a political upheaval within the boundaries of France. It was a transformation of society, governance, and ideas that reverberated across continents. Its 10-year arc, from the calling of the Estates General in 1789 to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte in 1799, marked a definitive break from the old regime and reshaped the modern world. By the time the revolution ended, it had dismantled centuries-old hierarchies, established a republic, executed a king, waged wars of survival and conquest, and laid the ideological foundations for both democratic freedoms and modern authoritarianism. To understand its enduring significance, it is essential to examine its major themes and legacy: political, social, intellectual, and historiographical. Political changes from monarchy to republic. The collapse of absolute monarchy. The revolution's most visible political transformation was the dismantling of France's absolute monarchy. For over a century, the Bourbon kings had ruled under the doctrine of the divine right of kings. Louis XIV's statement, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state, epitomized this worldview. By 1792, however, this centuries-old institution had collapsed under the combined pressure of financial crisis, Enlightenment thought, and popular revolt. The revolution began with demands for reform, not abolition. The Estates General of 1789 was intended to address fiscal deadlock, but the refusal of the privileged estates to share tax burdens drove the Third Estate toward revolutionary action. By 1791, France had a constitutional monarchy. By 1792, the execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 was more than an act of political justice. It was a statement that sovereignty resided not in a single ruler, but in the people. This principle, however imperfectly applied, became a cornerstone of modern political thought. Republican experimentation. The French Republic, proclaimed in September 1792, was the first of its kind in a major European nation since antiquity. It introduced universal male suffrage, though briefly, codified the separation of church and state, and experimented with mass political mobilization through clubs, festivals, and propaganda. Yet, the Republic was unstable. Successive governments, the Legislative Assembly, the National Convention, the Committee of Public Safety, and the Directory struggled to balance liberty with security. The radical Jacobin phase emphasized virtue and equality, but at the cost often betrayed revolutionary ideals. The rise of modern statecraft. The revolution also advanced the concept of the centralized, modern nation-state. The administrative reorganization into departments, standardized legal codes, national conscription, levée en masse, and secular public education all reflected the new model of a strong, centralized government, one that would be inherited and expanded by Napoleon. Social transformation, end of feudal privileges, abolition of feudalism. One of the revolution's most immediate and profound changes was the formal abolition of feudal privileges on the night of 4th August 1789. Noble hunting rights, seigneurial dues, tithes to the church, all were swept away. This was not simply symbolic. It freed peasants from obligations that had bound them for centuries. Erosion of the estate system. The revolution dismantled the rigid three estates social structure. Nobles and clergy lost their legal privileges, and careers in government, military, and administration were, in theory, open to talent rather than birth. The Revolution's meritocratic ideals would influence French society well into the 19th century and inspire reforms elsewhere in Europe. Impact on religion. The Civil Constitution of the Clergy, 1790, and subsequent de-Christianization campaigns broke the Catholic Church's institutional power in France. Church lands were confiscated, and clergy were required to swear loyalty to the state. While this alienated many devout Catholics, it also marked a decisive move toward secular governance, an enduring theme in French politics. Women in the Revolution. Although the Revolution did not grant women equal political rights, it mobilized them in unprecedented ways. From the Women's March on Versailles, 1789, to political activists like Olympe de Gouges, women played a critical role in revolutionary politics, pushing the boundaries of civic participation. While their demands for suffrage were rejected, their activism laid groundwork for future feminist movements. Spread of revolutionary ideas across Europe and the world. Inspiration for reform and revolution. The French Revolution's ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, transcended France's borders. Revolutionary armies carried these ideas into Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and the German states, often dismantling feudal structures along the way. The Napoleonic Code, rooted in revolutionary legal reforms, would be adopted across Europe and Latin America. Atlantic revolutions. The revolution influenced and was influenced by the wider age of revolutions. It drew inspiration from the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, and, in turn, inspired revolts in Haiti, Ireland, and Latin America. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, was particularly significant. It was both a slave revolt and a colonial war for independence, directly linked to the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The Revolutionary Wars. France's wars against European monarchies spread not only political upheaval, but also military innovation, mass conscription, nationalist armies, and the idea of warfare for ideological purposes. This model of total war would echo into the 20th century. Long-term consequences for democracy and nationalism. Democratic ideals. Though the revolution's radical democracy was short-lived, its principles survived. Constitutions, representative assemblies, and legal equality before the law became defining features of modern states. Even reactionary regimes could not fully undo these changes. Birth of modern nationalism. The revolution redefined loyalty, from allegiance to a monarch to allegiance to the nation. The tricolor flag. The Marseillaise and civic festivals fostered a sense of national identity that transcended regional loyalties. This idea of the nation-state would inspire both unification movements, example, Italy, Germany, and anti-colonial struggles. Economic liberalism. By abolishing feudal restrictions and guild privileges, the revolution paved the way for capitalist economic systems. Property rights were reinforced. Internal trade barriers removed, and secular laws replaced religious economic regulations. Historical debates, success or failure. Historians remain divided over whether the French Revolution was a triumph of liberty or a cautionary tale of excess. Arguments for success. It destroyed the old regime and established the principles of legal equality. It laid the groundwork for modern secular representative government. It inspired global movements for democracy and human rights. Arguments for failure. It descended into violence, culminating in the Reign of Terror. Many of its democratic gains were reversed under Napoleon's authoritarian rule. Women and certain social classes saw limited or no gains. Marxist interpretation. Marxist historians have viewed the revolution as a bourgeois revolution, a necessary step in the transition from feudalism to capitalism. In this view, it was less about universal liberty and more about replacing revisionist views. Later historians have questioned the inevitability of the revolution and emphasized the role of contingency, political miscalculation, and cultural factors. They argue that the revolution was as much a product of political breakdown as of class struggle. Conclusion: the enduring legacy of the French Revolution. The French Revolution, 1789 to 1799, stands as one of the most transformative events in human history. A decade when the old world order collapsed and a new political and social reality emerged. Rooted in centuries of inequality, intellectual ferment, and political stagnation, the revolution's causes were as deep as they were varied. The absolutism of the Bourbon monarchy, the rigidity of the three estate system, economic crises worsened by wars and poor harvests, and the spread of Enlightenment ideals combined to create a tinderbox ready to ignite. That ignition came in 1789 with the convocation of the Estates General, the birth of the National Assembly, and the storming of the Bastille, acts that shattered the foundations of royal authority. And the restructuring of church and state represented some of the revolution's most profound achievements. Yet these gains were accompanied by periods of intense violence, such as the Reign of Terror, where ideals of liberty and equality were enforced through fear and the guillotine. The political pendulum swung from monarchy to constitutional government, to radical republic, and finally to the authoritarian stability promised by Napoleon Bonaparte. The revolution's legacy was not limited to France. Across Europe and the wider world, revolutionary ideals spread like wildfire. The concepts of popular sovereignty, secular governance, and universal rights inspired movements from Latin America's wars of independence to the revolutions of 1848. Even where monarchies survived, they were forced to adapt, gradually incorporating reforms that acknowledged the power of public opinion and the necessity. Yet historians still debate whether the revolution was ultimately a success or failure. It destroyed the old feudal order and laid the groundwork for modern nation-states. but at a tremendous human cost. It proclaimed the rights of man, but often fell short in protecting them during its most radical phases. It promised liberty, but sometimes delivered authoritarianism. Perhaps this paradox is what gives the revolution its enduring fascination. It was a human endeavor, noble in aspiration, flawed in execution, and monumental in consequence. For the modern world, the French Revolution remains a touchstone, a reminder that profound change is possible, but rarely simple. It teaches that the struggle for equality and justice is often turbulent, that ideals must be defended as fiercely in times of victory as in times of oppression, and that the voices of ordinary people can reshape the destiny of nations. Its story is one of courage and compromise. More than 2 centuries later, the echoes of 1789 still resound in debates over rights, representation, and the meaning of democracy. The French Revolution was not merely a moment in French history. It was a turning point in the human story, a beacon and a warning for all who seek to change the world.